A lot of things to answer this particular lesson, which I would call the principles of reducing, thickening agents, and liaisons. Liaisons, of course, is the French term that means the thing that holds it together, which would be a thickening agent in this case, okay? First, I'm gonna give you a little lecture about the principles and fundamental techniques that revolve around the use of the word and the actual process of reducing something, okay? Reducing, let's begin there. Reducing begins by its definition, boiling something down so that it has less volume. You're reducing the amount of it, okay? Now, things are reduced, and the only things that are reduced in cooking are stock, sauce, and soup. Anything that's, quote, reduced, that isn't one of those three things, has one of those three things in it. Braising liquid, stew, whatever it happens to be, okay? So reducing is primarily devoted for stock, sauce, and soup, and it is done and executed in cooking for only two reasons. Now, this word's being thrown around a lot in the cooking and eating world, and it's a little bit misunderstood by some people, and I want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear about what the two reasons are that anyone would reduce anything, okay? The first reason, which would probably, I would call it the most important one of the two, and they're both important, okay, is that as something reduces and boils away, the flavor becomes more concentrated. Now, I'm going to give you the best example that I can so that I'm sure that you get this. This is very, very important that you understand this principle, because you're going to impose this principle and put it into your thinking every time you make a stock, soup, or sauce your whole life after you learn this, because this principle is unchallenged and absolute in nature, okay? So I'm going to explain it to you so that you get it really well. The first time I got this, it opened up worlds of cooking for me, and my food tasted better once I understood this. Now, let's assume for a minute that I have 2 cups of brown stock right there, and I reduce this down to 1 cup. I reduce it meaning I boil it on the stove, or high simmer it on the stove until only half of the 2 cups is left. What has transpired during this boiling down process? First, very important for you to understand, is that the only thing that ever left that saucepan while that brown stock was reducing was water. Nothing else left that pan except water. There's no flavor exchange that ever leaves the pan during the reducing process. So now I have 1 cup of brown stock that used to be 2 cups sitting in my saucepan, or now it's in my imaginary measuring cup here, okay? What have I accomplished? I have half the amount of liquid and twice as much flavor. So I took the flavor from 2 cups and put it into 1 cup. If I theoretically were to continue the reducing process and take that 1 cup and reduce it down to a half a cup, what would I have? I would now have the flavor of 2 cups of brown stock down to a half a cup, which would make it 3 times as strong, almost, okay? So, the only thing that ever left during the reducing was the water. All the brown stock flavor was still there. Now, reconstitution of a reduced stock. This is important to understand. This is not the second reason why people do this, okay? The first reason I said was it increases the flavor and puts it into less volume. What I really did is I told you the second reason at the same time. It decreases the volume. If you have 16 quarts of stock because you started out with 10 pounds of bones, where are you going to put 16 quarts of stock? Even in a commercial kitchen, people don't use thin, unreduced stock and store it unless it's very temporary. Typically, it's reduced down and the flavor is increased through the reducing process, and then it's stored. In some cases of reducing it down to what we call a concentrate, which is 1/16 the original volume. So assuming that I started with 16 quarts of stock that came from 10 pounds of bones, and I reduce it down to 1 quart, now I have 1 quart of homemade brown beef base, if you will. And if it was chicken stock, then it would be chicken base. Okay? Now, if I take that 1 quart, or that half of a cup I have now, whichever example you want to follow here in this lecture, and add the 16 quarts of water back to the 1 quart of reduced stock, or I add the 1.5 cups of water back to the half cup, I'm reconstituting both of these reduced stocks back to their original size. I wouldn't normally do that because the main reason I'm reducing it is for concentrating the flavor, but you're decreasing the volume. So let's say you wanted to have the flavor of 3 cups of ground juice concentrated down into 2 tablespoons so you can season the sauce in a saute pan. This is a way that you can concentrate the flavor and now use this flavor that you made. You made this flavor when you did this. This is not something you went and bought. Okay? You make this flavor and then you add it to things in small amounts. Otherwise, you could flood your food with excess amount of stock and never ever get the effects of the flavor of all that stock. So concentrating or reducing, you can use words can be used hand in hand or interchange, is for 2 reasons. Increase the flavor into less volume of liquid. No other reason. Anybody tells you there's any other reason to reduce anything other than to make it convenient in a smaller container to store it is telling you a story. That's it. So, very important to understand that. And the reason I'm emphasizing it to you the way I am and the importance of it is I have seen professional cooks in the marketplace taking instant chicken broth, adding water to it, and then begin reducing it. They didn't even understand the principles of reduction. So it's very important you understand this. Why would anyone obviously put instant chicken and put more water in it than they needed to and then start reducing it? If they were going to do that, just put less water in. I mean, you know. So anyway, it's very important you get this. All right, so I think you got it now. I'm going to move on. So that would be one of the thickening agents, if you will. This natural reduction process, we're going to stay, in this particular lecture, we're going to stay with the concept of the brown beef stock in its 2 cups, okay? The reducing process itself creates another texture in the juice as it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, it will be like glue, so you got to be careful how much you reduce it. There's such a thing as over-reducing, okay? Just have to adjust the flame on a stove or something. Okay, now, so that would be one thickening agent, if you will. It's an invisible agent. It's not an actual thing. It's just something that happens when you reduce. It gets thicker, okay? The second thickening agent that I'll demonstrate for you in this particular lesson, and there's a whole slew of them, but we're only doing 3 in this lesson: natural reduction, ROUX, and cornstarch. I'm going to go now to the cornstarch slurry, which is the term that's used to describe the solution that you make when you add water or another cold liquid to cornstarch and mix it together so that it's smooth. This is called a slurry, and in the case of cornstarch, it's a cornstarch slurry. Now, cornstarch slurries are used in Chinese cooking a lot. That's why you see that cornstarchy glaze on a lot of their food. And it's also something that we use in all Western and European cooking in various amounts at various times for different reasons, sometimes in conjunction with ROUX or natural reducing, or all 3. You could, for example, Richard, I need you to come in a little bit closer now. I have a brown juice on the stove, for example, and we're going to make a cornstarch slurry to thicken it. Now, what I could do is, and I've already reduced it a fair amount, okay? I need you, if you can come down in here. Okay. I'll tell you what, we're going to come right back. We need to change the tape for a second. We'll come right back. Okay, we just wanted to get one of our cameras positioned so you could see this perfectly, okay? Now, the cornstarch slurry. Now, I'm going to use water, but you could use orange juice or sherry. Chinese and a lot of the Asian cooks use sherry, in fact, with their cornstarch, if they intend to add sherry to the dish. we're going to use water. That would be the standard. And so I'm going to take a little bit of cornstarch. Now the formula for this, which is in the ingredient list, is always 1 tablespoon of cornstarch and 1 tablespoon of cold water. But I'm looking for a specific texture here. It doesn't matter if I measure this. The important thing is that I got the slurry right. Let me use the back of this spoon here. Could stick my fingers in there. If you're making a large amount of this, you should add the cornstarch to the water. It makes it go in smoother and faster. But this is okay. We're doing fine. So there's our cornstarch slurry. You see there? It's all one thing now, right? Now we're going to bring over here to the brown juice. Turn it up. It's been coming to a boil. Now I'm going to show you the texture of the brown juice now so you can see the before and after effects of thickening it, okay? This is one of the things called how to make sauce. The difference between sauce and stock is one is thicker and one's not, and sauce has a tendency to have had a series of flavoring considerations imposed on it. That's why it's called sauce. Otherwise, it's usually referred to as gravy, which would be thickened stock, but not particularly refined, okay? Now, you see the broth texture. Here, it's like very watery. You see what I mean? Now, I'm going to use a little bit of cornstarch in here. And I could thicken this with just cornstarch if I wanted to. Now, you'll see already, you can't really see, but I can see, excuse me. It tightened up just slightly, but not enough. Now, I'm going to put another little pinch of cornstarch slurry in there. That's thickening. Now, I'm adding this to the boiling stock. Cornstarch normally thickens things because you add it to the boiling or simmering liquid. You normally would not put cornstarch into a cold stock or sauce because cornstarch thickens it so fast, you can see its effects immediately. So you can add, mix until you get it to exactly where you want it. Roux, which we're going to go to in a minute, isn't quite like that. You have to be a little bit more measured in your approach to how much you're adding to the sauce. And typically you do want to add the roux to the sauce when it's cold. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But for right now, this is starting to get a clean plate here so it's easier to look at. I'm getting a little bit thicker. Okay. Now here's what I'm going to do. I've got this thing reduced down to a fairly good concentrated flavor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that cook for a minute. And while I'm doing that, we're going to make a little bit of roux. We're going to talk about roux. And I'm going to add a pinch of roux also to this. So in fact, in the demonstrated case in this lecture about thickening agents and liaisons, the 3 that I'm covering in this lesson, I'm going to impose and use all 3 of them into this one stock to show you the flexibility of using your different thickening agents. Again, I like to say and emphasize that I could just continue using cornstarch and it would have that nice translucent look. But I'm going to add a pinch of roux to this. And because I've been using reducing as an element of thickening this, I now have all 3 of the thickening agents that we're using in this particular lesson in that one little pot. You could, of course, just use the roux also. You don't have to use the cornstarch and the roux in this particular case. Okay, you do whatever you want. And I want you to understand this. This goes back to the spirit of cooking. There's a lot of people out there that will say, well, you must thicken this with cornstarch or you must thicken this with roux. And I'm here to tell you that you can use a little bit of both or neither one of them if you want to, okay? As long as you understand the outcome of using them, they will always be slightly different. Obviously, if you use a little bit of roux in the sauce or the stock to thicken it, coupled with the cornstarch, it's not going to have that complete translucent look. It doesn't mean that it's not going to have a beautiful sheen and be a great sauce. It just means it won't have the cornstarch look, okay? So, let's go back to the sauce for a second. And it has thickened up slightly. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of butter, and I'm going to put it in the sauce, in this little saute pan here. We're going to make a small amount of roux, and we're going to talk about roux. Let's talk about the roux right now. R-O-U-X, roux. There are a number, as in about 5, and I'll count them for you up in a second here when I'm done. Levels of cooking that are applied to these flour and oil / butter mixtures. So roux is defined as flour added to some kind of fat or oil. Traditionally, clarified butter or whole butter. Usually clarified. We're using whole butter today. It's no big deal. Now, some people will use olive oil or half butter, half olive oil. Somebody else might use vegetable oil to make their roux. So it's fat. Could be duck fat, could be goose fat, could be any kind of fat, could be chicken fat. You could take schmaltz and mix flour into it after you melt it. So schmaltz meaning chicken fat. That, of course, would be the Jewish reference term for chicken fat. So anyway, we got some melted butter here, and I'm going to take a little bit of all-purpose flour. Again, just like the cornstarch, roux has the same measurements. 1 tablespoon of clarified butter, 1 tablespoon of flour. But that's all good to know, and that's all fine and dandy to know. But what you really want to know is what is the texture that you want to end up with. So in this particular case, I've got a certain amount of butter in there, and it doesn't matter how much it is. It only matters what the texture is of the roux when I'm done. And I'll tell you why in a second. So we'll just add a little bit of flour to the butter, mix it in. Now you don't want it too thick, and that's what I mean by texture. Now there's a reason why you don't want it too thick. You don't want it too thick because if you intend on cooking the roux, you want it to be able to cook evenly. If it's really thick, it won't be able to lay out in the pan well and cook now. Now this mixture right here, which is just slightly thin, I'm going to put a pinch more flour in there, okay? Maybe more than a pinch. Maybe about 20 pinches, okay? All right, now just want to get that a little bit thicker. Now this mixture right here, okay, this is called beurre meni. That means flour and oil or butter that have never been cooked. Now, if you don't want your sauce to taste floury, which can happen if you're not careful, you use beurre meni because the flour is not cooked. The more you cook the flour, the less it shows up in your sauce as tasting like flour, okay? So there's your, what they call beurre meni, which is one of the thickening agents that we will use from time to time throughout this course. Not today, though, in terms of this here. Now, if I cook this, which I'm going to do right now, for about 3 or 4 minutes on top of the stove, we will have what's called pale roux, which is slightly cooked but not brown, okay? We're going to let that sit back there and cook for a couple of minutes. And the reason we're doing that is that, first of all, a slightly nutty flavor begins to be taken on by the flour in the roux, and ultimately you'll be adding that flavor into your stock and sauce. Slightly nutty flavor. More importantly, it reduces the flour taste when you make the roux pale rather than the beurre meni, which is not cooked. Okay? Beurre meni you keep around or use when you've either didn't have time to process the roux or put it in or skim the sauce or whatever it is, and you needed to add something to it at the end to your sauce to thicken it quickly, and you didn't feel like using cornstarch. That's where beurre meni comes in. It's more of a convenience roux sitting around. You could, of course, make pale roux or brown roux and use that as your convenience roux also. Okay? I'm not suggesting that the beurre meni is bad and wrong or not good or will make your food taste this. You just want to make sure you don't use it in large amounts because it's not cooked at all. Okay? Then that brings us to the brown roux. Okay? This thing is cooking right along back there. Brown roux, which is the same mixture here, only I took this pan and I put it in the oven at about 300, 325, 350 for about half an hour, 40 minutes until it got, as you can see for yourself, very brown. Now this has a very nutty flavor. This does two things when you add it to the sauce. This would normally just be added to a brown sauce, okay? Not to be confused with black roux in Louisiana cooking, which we will cover on the Louisiana class. The black roux, which is used in gumbo and so on. But this is brown roux, and brown roux does two things and is used primarily for one thing. It goes into brown stocks. You wouldn't put brown roux in a white sauce because then it'll screw up the color of your white sauce a little bit. Although who knows, you may want the flavor of the brown roux and the color added to your white sauce for whatever reason. That's up to you. But traditionally, that's not how it's handled. So again, I never finished my sentence here. Let me start over again. The two reasons why you would use the brown roux in the brown stock rather than the pale roux or the Berrimani, the pale roux which you were cooking back here, is because you impart the nutty flavor of the cooked flour coupled with the color of the roux, which further enhances the brown color of the brown sauce. Okay? So what we're going to do is, since we have a brown juice right here that's partially reduced and partially thickened with cornstarch, we're going to take a little bit of the brown roux, as you see right here, and I'm going to throw it in there. So we're going to be thickening, for this demonstration lesson example, we're thickening this brown stock with all three of the thickening agents from this particular lesson: cornstarch, natural reduction, and roux. Okay? Now, some people would argue that roux is outdated, not a shape, and we don't do things like that, and we only, quote, do natural reduction. That's all fine and dandy to say, think, and do, and there's certainly a lot of value to only imposing natural reduction into your cooking. But the great cook, which differs from the good cook, has a whole repertoire of different things that they use for just the right moments at just the right time. You may be a cook that 80% of the time, which is what I'd probably recommend in general, if I had to pick a number out of the sky, let's say it was 80%. 80% of the time you may use natural reduction with your brown juices or your chicken stocks and so on as your primary thickening agent. But there's going to be those moments where you don't want that. You don't want it reduced that much, and you need a little bit more body without as much reduction for one reason or another. And the reasons are there's so many of them, there's no point in even going into it. But for this particular class, it's important for you to understand that the concept of not using roux and being, quote, so much more better, which is totally untrue, that you would reduce instead of using roux. I think using roux and how it's applied, how it's imposed, how it goes into the sauce, whether or not there's skimming that takes place and the insolubles from the milling process of the flour are removed slowly during the reducing process, as they are, and all scum and fat is removed from stocks and sauces throughout this course. So if you do good cooking practices when you're using roux, there's nothing wrong with it. The concept, again, I want to go back to just to say I don't agree with, and I agree with from time to time, is that there's some advantage with the natural reduction over the options of using roux from time to time. I think one needs to be able to do both and know when to do which one, how much, which time. And that's what this course will teach you. This course will not tell you only do natural reduction or only do roux, because this course is not about me telling you what to cook. This is about me telling you how to cook. Okay, all right. I'm done with that, and I have a lot invested in this particular topic that has to do with how the things are thickened, because I spent 30 years making sauce and worked the sauce stations in so many of my own restaurants and other ones in French restaurants. And there's a variety of thinking on this subject. And I think mine is a little bit more processed than the average person. And it's certainly not influenced by any media coverage of what's good and what's bad. I'll never forget the day I picked up the newspaper and it said, basil is out of style for the next 2 months. Well, whoever wrote that is out of style. All right, so anyway, back to the sauce. Now you'll see that this sauce, let me get a clean plate here so we can check the texture of this. We got a couple of lumps in there right now. That's okay. I'm going to let this reduce now for a few minutes, and I'm going to skim out the insolubles from that flour and anything that may come to the surface because of the cornstarch that was added. And the pale roux is cooked, by the way. There it is. So let me summarize the thickening agent. You see it's bubbling there. It's cooked, but it's not brown, and that's another flavor additive. and another reason why you cook it, so it has a little flavor. So let me summarize for you quickly. Reduction, roux, cornstarch. Those are the three things that we just covered. And those three are the primary ones that are being used today. The other ones that we will be covering further down the line in the course will include using potatoes, rice, starchy vegetables, pureed into the sauce. In the Mexican class, for example, we have tortillas pureed in a stock. There's a certain kind of tortilla you should use for that and so on. And then in the Louisiana class, we have a black roux, which is just more of this brown roux cooked, really. And then we have tapioca, which is boiled in the sauce, which gives off somewhat of a cornstarch type effect, but a little bit thicker than that usually. And then you can just take bread, and it has flour in it too. Bread or tortillas was another example I just used. Put that directly into sauce and let it cook, and it will thicken the sauce and aid in the thickness of the sauce as it reduces. Throw a couple slices of bread right in the sauce. There's other ways to thicken the sauce than the normal ways. You're going to learn all of them in this course. The three primary ones you just were shown, and I hope you got a good understanding of those. We're going to come back in about 5 minutes. I'm going to do this sauce in 2 takes. We're going to strain this sauce. We're going to season it. We're going to look at the texture of it on the plate. That will help you understand what the thickening agent's about. It's about creating the texture of the sauce. The completion of the thickening of the brown stock. This is the one that we use the combination, again, of the roux, the cornstarch, and natural reduction. So now, and I've been skimming this the last few minutes, now we have a thickened sauce that I think justifies the term sauce consistency. And I'll show you that on a plate in a minute. But we're going to strain this into a small container that you can see through here. You'll notice how I push that through there like that. Okay. Got a few dribbles here. We'll take care of that. Okay, now I want you to take a look at this consistency, see? Now, some people would say that's thick, but this is a basic brown sauce here now. I probably wouldn't use this directly as a finished sauce, but just for the record, I'm going to finish this sauce as if it is, and it could be, but I would have a tendency to add more flavor to this, which we're going to do in some of the other lessons in today's class. So let's assume that I was going to finish this sauce off. I might do this here. Because buttering the sauce includes whipping a little bit of butter into it and then adjusting the seasoning with salt and pepper in the proportions of 2 ounces per quart. I got about a cup and a half here, so I'm going to throw a little ½ ounce of whole soft unsalted butter in it, and I'm going to mix it in until it's completely absorbed in. That's called buttering the sauce. You need to do that, of course, when you want to enrich in it. Gives it a little bit of finishing flavor. Even has a finishing look to it that changes it slightly. The look isn't any better, but it does change it slightly. Now, I got some tasting spoons here, and we'll give her a taste. Initially, before we start putting any seasoning in it, the salt or peppers. This sauce is very good already, and that's because it's a nice brown juice that's well reduced. This only needs a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. Let's give that another taste. It's got enough salt in it for me. Remember, add seasoning, not the amount you think. Just so happens this was so close already. All it needed was a little pinch of salt. So there's your finished texture. And as a sauce on a plate next to a steak or a piece of chicken or something like this, this is the right texture in my opinion. I think the heaviness of the sauces are gone. But you'll notice that this doesn't look like a big, thick, flour thickened sauce. That's because this is part cornstarch, part roux, part reduction. So there's your lesson on those 3 thickening agents, okay? Have fun with that. I just hopefully opened up a whole world for you there.